6 months ago, my HOA declared war over a goldfish pond. Karen stood in my driveway with a bulldozer permit. Neighbors gasped when she threatened to drain it herself. I just smiled and asked her to wait 1 week. Something was shifting under the water and under the rules. Karen's hands started shaking when the mail truck arrived. She didn't know what I'd found living in that pond. By Friday, the federal government would be knocking on her door. My name's Dana Ellery, 38, mother of 2, married to a high school shop teacher named Rob. We bought our house on Chestnut Hollow Court 11 years ago, back when the neighborhood was half-built and the HOA was 3 retirees arguing over mailbox paint. Life was quiet, ordinary in the best way. Behind our house sat a small backyard pond I dug myself the summer my daughter turned 7, stocked with a few feeder goldfish and a rescued turtle named Gus. It was nothing fancy, just a hobby, a happy corner of dirt and water where my kids caught fireflies. I never imagined it would become a battlefield. The trouble started 3 years ago, when Karen Voss moved into the corner colonial with the immaculate topiary and ran, unopposed, for HOA president. She'd retired early from a corporate compliance job, and she brought that same rigid, checklist energy to a neighborhood that used to run on handshake agreements and casserole dishes. Karen didn't just enforce the bylaws. She rewrote them, quietly, 1 amendment at a time, until the 15-page document ballooned into 90. Mailbox height. Grass length measured, she claimed, to the 1/8 of an inch. Nobody questioned it at first, because nobody wanted to be Karen's next project. I met her properly at a block party the spring after she took office. She complimented my hydrangeas, then pivoted, almost seamlessly, into asking whether my water feature had been submitted for architectural review. I laughed, thinking she was joking. She was not. On a small spiral notepad she kept in her cardigan pocket. Over the next year, Karen's notepad became legend on Chestnut Hollow Court. She measured Tom Ridley's fence with a tape measure. She sent Priya Anand a violation notice for a non-compliant wind chime. She once reported her own husband's truck for parking 6 inches over the line. According to my neighbor who witnessed the argument, most people paid the small fines and moved on, because fighting Karen meant fighting the board. And the board, 3 people she'd personally recruited, always sided with her. It wasn't governance anymore. It was a fiefdom with a newsletter. And Karen signed every issue, your HOA president and neighbor. Karen, my pond, meanwhile, sat quietly behind a row of arborvitae, mostly out of sight from the street. Gus the turtle had grown from a rescue the size of a silver dollar into a sturdy, curious 15-year-old painted turtle who greeted my kids every morning by paddling straight to the edge for food. Then, 2 summers ago, something changed. A second turtle showed up on my back deck one June morning. Smaller, more angular shell, patterned like a spotted quilt. My daughter named her Biscuit. I figured she'd wandered from the creek behind the greenbelt and would wander right back out. She didn't. By the following spring, there were 4 turtles in that pond. Not 1. I didn't think much of it beyond mild wonder. Turtles like water, and mine happened to be a decent, shaded, predator light option compared to the drainage creek nearby, which the county had been improving with heavy machinery for 2 years. I mentioned the turtles once at a neighborhood cookout, mostly as a cute anecdote, not realizing Karen was standing 3 feet away refilling her sweet tea. She didn't say anything that night. But 2 weeks later, a certified letter arrived at my house. HOA letterhead. Subject line: Notice of unauthorized water feature. The letter cited section 14.3 of the bylaws. Ornamental water features exceeding 25 square feet require board approval, and gave me 30 days to either submit retroactive plans or drain the pond entirely. My pond, built 9 years earlier, had somehow just become a crisis requiring immediate correction. I called the HOA office, polite and confused, assuming it was a clerical mix-up. The woman who answered, Karen herself, turned out, since she handled violations personally, informed me the pond had been reported by a concerned resident. I asked who. She said that information was confidential per board policy. I later learned there was no such policy in writing. Karen had simply decided, that day, on the spot, that confidentiality applied whenever it protected her. It was a pattern I'd see again and again, rules invented in real time, always somehow bending in exactly the direction that served her. I asked Rob what he thought, half expecting him to tell me I was overreacting. Instead, he pulled out our closing documents and pointed to a line item, pond and landscaping, disclosed and approved by the developer in 2013, 4 years before the HOA even existed in its current form. We had paperwork. I photographed the disclosure form, attached it to a polite email, and sent it to the board within 48 hours, certain this would end the matter. I even added a line thanking them for their diligence. I was, at that point in my life, still someone who believed good documentation solved most problems. Karen's reply came 4 days later. Terse and strange. The developer's disclosure was not binding on the current association, because the bylaws had been materially updated since 2013. I read it 3 times, trying to find the logic. There wasn't any. Up to look like one. A neighbor, Priya, texted me that night with a warning dressed as sympathy. She did this to us over the wind chime. Just pay whatever fine and move on. It's not worth the headache. I appreciated the concern. But something about surrendering a 9-year-old pond over an invented rule didn't sit right with me. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting, my first ever, mostly to understand how 30 pages of bylaws could suddenly override a signed developer disclosure. The meeting was held in the clubhouse. Folding chairs arranged in tidy rows. Karen seated at a raised table like a judge presiding over her own courtroom. She opened with a 20-minute recap of community wins, which included a new sign banning inflatable pool toys visible from the street. When she reached new business, she called my case by address, not name, the water feature violation on lot 42, as if I weren't sitting 8 feet away. I stood, calmly explained the disclosure form, and asked the board directly whether they'd reviewed it. Karen answered before anyone else could. We've reviewed everything necessary, she said, and moved to table the discussion, banging a small wooden gavel she'd apparently bought specifically for these meetings. Nobody objected. Walking to my car afterward, an older man named Walt Beckham caught up with me in the parking lot. He'd lived on the street since before the HOA existed and told me, low and careful, that Karen had tried something similar with his koi pond 2 summers back, before he pushed back hard enough that she backed off. She doesn't like losing, Walt said, but she especially doesn't like anyone finding out she lost. He wouldn't elaborate further, glancing toward the clubhouse windows like Karen might be reading his lips from 50 feet away. I thanked him, unsettled, and drove home turning his words over the whole way. The following week, the fines began $200, then $400 when I didn't immediately comply, tacked onto our HOA dues with a due date and a threatening line about further association action. I paid the first one under protest, mostly to buy time to figure out what further action even meant. Rob wanted to hire a lawyer immediately. I hesitated. Lawyers cost money we didn't love spending on a hobby pond, and instead started digging through the actual bylaw amendments myself, comparing dates, cross-referencing the developer paperwork, building a timeline. If Karen was going to invent rules, I was going to document reality. What I found unsettled me more than the fines ever could. The material update Karen cited had been passed at a board meeting with exactly 9 residents present, out of 240 households, on a Tuesday afternoon in February with no advance notice posted anywhere except a single flyer in the clubhouse lobby. I requested the meeting minutes through the HOA's official records process, as was my right under the association's own bylaws. Karen denied the request in writing, citing ongoing litigation concerns, litigation that, as far as I could tell, involved nothing but my own unanswered emails. I started keeping a folder. Everything, dated. 2 weeks later, a contractor's truck pulled into my driveway unannounced while I was at work. My neighbor, Priya, watched from her window as 2 men in HOA-branded polo shirts walked my backyard with clipboards, photographing the pond from every angle, before leaving a business card wedged in my back door. The card read, Association-approved water feature removal, call for estimate. I hadn't approved anyone entering my property, hadn't signed a removal order, hadn't even received a hearing date. When I called the number, a receptionist confirmed the job had been scheduled by Karen from the HOA for the following Monday. I called Karen directly, voice steadier than I felt. She insisted this was standard procedure once a violation went unresolved past 60 days, and that I'd had ample opportunity to comply. I reminded her the matter was still under dispute, that no hearing had occurred. She said the board's decision was final and hung up. That night, I called my cousin Marisol, a paralegal, and read her the entire timeline. She went quiet for a moment, then said the thing that changed everything. Dana, HOAs can't just send contractors onto private property without a court order or your written consent. What she's describing isn't procedure. It's trespassing. Marisol connected me with a local attorney named Felix O'Yelleran, who specialized in HOA disputes and, as it turned out, had a soft spot for exactly this kind of case. An overreaching board versus a homeowner with actual paperwork on their side. He agreed to review everything for a modest flat fee. Felix's first move was simple. A cease and desist letter reminding the HOA, in careful legal language, that entering private property without consent or a valid court order could constitute trespass, and that any contractor damage to my pond or its inhabitants could expose both the contractor and the association to liability. The Monday appointment never happened. No truck showed up. A new letter arrived, this one announcing a special assessment of $600 per household, association-wide, for necessary landscaping compliance enforcement. Karen had found a way to make my dispute everyone's problem, and everyone's problem tends to make enemies. The neighborhood group chat, usually reserved for lost cats and garage sale flyers, exploded within hours. Some neighbors were furious about the assessment without understanding why it existed. Others, like Walt, quietly messaged me privately, "This is about your pond, isn't it?" I admitted it was. He said, simply, "Don't back down." Karen, sensing the mood shifting, called an emergency board meeting to address rumors before I even knew one had been scheduled. She stood at the podium and told 40-some neighbors that a resident's unauthorized wildlife habitat was costing the association legal fees and driving down property values. She never said my name. She didn't need to. I stood up anyway, introduced myself, and asked the room directly, had anyone actually seen my backyard, or were they voting on an assessment based on Karen's description of it? A murmur rippled through the folding chairs. Karen's jaw tightened upon request, though none had ever been shared with residents. A woman near the back, Denise Okafor, whose son played baseball with mine, raised her hand and asked bluntly why the board hadn't simply scheduled a hearing before jumping to contractors and special assessments. Karen's answer was long, technical, and answered nothing. Denise looked at me afterward and mouthed, "This is insane." The assessment vote was tabled, not defeated, a small, temporary win that still left the underlying violation notice standing, fines accruing, and Karen's authority fundamentally unchallenged. I left that meeting understanding something important. Winning individual battles wouldn't be enough. I needed something that made the entire premise of her attack collapse. That weekend, sitting by the pond with my morning coffee, I counted the turtles out of habit. Gus, Biscuit, and two more I'd started calling Waffle and Pepper, and noticed Biscuit's shell pattern again. That distinct radiating star design I'd never bothered to look up. On a whim, I finally did. I photographed her shell from 3 angles and posted in a regional wildlife identification group online. Mostly out of curiosity, half expecting someone to tell me she was a common painted turtle with unusual markings. Instead, a reply came within the hour from a wildlife biologist named Trent Ashworth. "Can you confirm your general location?" I gave him the county, cautiously, unsure why it mattered. His next message made my stomach drop in the best possible way. "That pattern strongly resembles a spotted turtle, Clemys guttata. They're state-listed as a species of special concern, and federally protected under certain habitat conditions. Would you be willing to let me visit?" I said yes before I'd even finished reading the sentence twice. Then sat there staring at the pond, at Biscuit sunning herself on the flat rock my daughter had painted years ago, suddenly seeing the whole absurd, infuriating situation from an entirely different angle. Karen wanted this pond gone. I might have something worth protecting. Trent visited that Thursday afternoon, waders and a field notebook in hand, and spent nearly 2 hours cataloging the pond water quality, basking structures, surrounding vegetation, and each turtle individually, photographing shell patterns and taking careful measurements. He confirmed it on the spot. Biscuit was, almost certainly, a spotted turtle. "They're rare around here," he explained, crouched at the pond's edge. "Habitat loss. Mostly, wetlands drained for development, creeks channelized for drainage projects. If your county's been doing creek work nearby, that could explain why she relocated. This pond might genuinely be functioning as refuge habitat for a declining population." He asked careful, methodical questions. How long had the pond existed? Was it spring-fed or man-made? Had I ever introduced turtles myself? I explained Gus, the original rescue, and how the others simply arrived on their own over 2 years. Trent nodded slowly. That's the part that matters. This habitat formed naturally, before he left. Trent mentioned, almost as an aside, that state wildlife agencies sometimes worked with private landowners to formally document and protect confirmed habitat for species of concern. Not seizing property, just recognizing it, with real legal weight behind that recognition. He offered to file a preliminary habitat assessment request. I said yes immediately. I didn't tell Karen or the HOA anything yet. Felix, my attorney, advised patience. Get the documentation solid first. Because half-finished good news was, in his words, just an invitation for someone to find a loophole before you've closed the door. I agreed, though staying quiet took real, gritted teeth discipline. Meanwhile, the fines kept arriving, now totaling just over $1,400. Each notice slightly more threatening than the last, culminating in a letter mentioning lien proceedings if the balance remained unpaid past 90 days. Felix responded to each one methodically, always citing the pending dispute, always keeping a paper trail growing in our favor. Karen, apparently frustrated by my continued lack of visible panic, shifted tactics. She began appearing at community events, specifically where I'd be, my daughter's school bake sale, the neighborhood 4th of July gathering, making pointed comments about certain residents who think rules don't apply to them, just loud enough for others to hear. At the bake sale, she picked up one of my daughter's decorated cupcakes, examined it, and remarked to another mother that some people care more about pond scum than community standards. My daughter, 11 years old, heard every word. She didn't cry. In the car, why Mrs. Voss hated our turtles. That question sat heavier with me than any fine or legal letter had. This had stopped being about bylaws or property lines. Karen had made it personal, made it about my kids, and something in me, patient, documentation-focused, lawyer advised me, quietly decided this fight was no longer optional. It was necessary. I called Felix that evening and told him about the bake sale comment, the pattern of public targeting, the growing sense that Karen wasn't enforcing rules so much as running a personal vendetta with HOA letterhead as cover. He listened, then asked a question that reframed everything. Has anyone else had this happen to them? I hadn't thought to ask. Not systematically. So I started carefully, quietly, one conversation at a time, beginning with Walt and his koi pond story. What I found, over the following 2 weeks, was not one isolated incident. It was a pattern, stretching back 3 years, involving at least 11 different households. Walt's koi pond, threatened with removal 2 years earlier, had been abandoned only after he personally confronted Karen with his own attorney present, a fact she'd apparently made sure never reached the newsletter. Denise had been fined for a garden gnome collection Karen called visually cluttered, a violation invented, as far as anyone could tell, on the spot. Priya's wind chime fine, turned out, coincided almost exactly with a week when her husband had publicly disagreed with Karen at a board meeting about parking enforcement. The timing wasn't proof of anything by itself. But stacked against the others, a shape was starting to emerge, retaliation, dressed up as procedure. I began keeping a second folder, separate from my own case, just documenting patterns, dates, complaints, board votes, who'd crossed Karen and when the fines had followed. I wasn't building a legal case yet. I was building a picture, The kind that makes a room full of people go quiet when they finally see it. One evening, Denise invited several of us over: Walt, Priya, myself, two other households who'd quietly messaged me their own stories for what she called, half joking, a very informal, definitely not a conspiracy dinner. 6 households, 6 separate grievances, one common thread. Nobody had ever compared notes before. Karen had made sure of that, deliberately or not. Over lasagna and lukewarm iced tea, we mapped out 3 years of Karen's presidency on a legal pad, special assessments that seemed to appear whenever the reserve fund dipped, board votes that always somehow passed unanimously, meeting minutes that Karen personally controlled, and occasionally, several people swore, didn't match what was actually said aloud. Walt mentioned something that made the room go still. 2 years ago, the HOA's landscaping budget had jumped nearly 40%. Right around the time Karen's brother-in-law started running Voss Property Solutions, the same contracting company that had shown up uninvited in my driveway. Nobody had ever questioned the contract. Karen approved vendors personally. I didn't say much that night, mostly listened, filling pages in my folder with names, dates, and dollar figures that would need real verification before they meant anything. But driving home, I understood something new. This wasn't a fight over a pond anymore. It was a fight over exactly how much power one person should quietly hold. I called Trent the next morning, partly for a habitat update, partly just needing to hear something grounded and factual after a night of half-verified suspicions. He had good news. The preliminary assessment supported spotted turtle presence, multiple individuals, parent breeding activity, and a formal site visit from the State Wildlife Agency was being scheduled. If they confirm what I'm seeing, Trent said carefully, this pond could qualify for habitat protections under state conservation law and potentially trigger federal review too, depending on connectivity to protected wetlands nearby. That's not something your HOA can simply override with a bylaw. Wildlife law sits above homeowner association rules. Full stop. I thanked him, hung up, and sat with that sentence for a long moment. Above homeowner association rules. Full stop. For months, Karen had operated as though her authority were absolute, unquestionable, backed by nothing more than her own gavel and confidence. This was the first real, structural crack I'd found in that illusion. Felix, when I updated him, was cautiously thrilled but insisted on strategy over celebration. Don't announce anything yet, he said. Let the state process play out fully. Get it in writing. And meanwhile, let's respond to every one of Karen's fines and letters like we're building a file for court, because we might be. So I did exactly that. Methodically, almost meditatively, every letter answered, every fine disputed in writing, every claim cross-referenced against actual bylaw language and dates. Karen, for her part, seemed to sense something had shifted, though she couldn't name what. Her letters grew longer, more aggressive, laced with phrases like, final warning. At the next HOA meeting, she opened with an unusually long statement about residents attempting to undermine community governance through delay tactics, clearly aimed at me without naming me directly. I sat quietly, said nothing, and simply took notes because I now understood that patience, properly documented, was its own kind of weapon. After the meeting, Denise pulled me aside in the parking lot, practically vibrating with nervous energy. She'd requested 3 years of HOA financial statements through the official records process. Her right as a homeowner, and Karen had denied the request twice, citing vague privacy concerns that made no sense for association-wide financial documents. Denise wasn't the type to let that go. Her husband was an accountant, and between the two of them, they filed a formal written demand citing the specific state statute requiring HOAs to disclose financial records to homeowners within a set number of business days. Karen had 5 days to comply or explain why not. Karen's response arrived on day 4. Partial records only, heavily redacted, citing ongoing vendor negotiations as justification for withholding the landscaping contract details entirely. The same contract, Denise's husband quietly pointed out, that traced back to Karen's own brother-in-law's company. The redactions themselves were starting to look like a confession. Meanwhile, my own case took an unexpected turn. Felix discovered, buried in county records, that the HOA's 2019 bylaw amendment, the one Karen cited to override my pond's developer disclosure, had never actually been properly filed with the county recorder's office, a step legally required for certain amendments to take effect. In plain terms, the amendment Karen had spent months threatening me with might not have been legally valid this entire time. Felix drafted a formal letter to the board, copying every member individually, laying out the filing defect in careful, unemotional legal language, and requesting immediate withdrawal of all fines and violation notices against me. The letter went out on a Tuesday. By Thursday, 2 of the 3 board members, quiet figures who rarely spoke at meetings, both of whom Karen had personally recruited, hadn't responded at all.
Karen herself sent a single line. The board stands.
Proper channels. Turned out, meant nothing happened for 3 more weeks. No formal response. No withdrawal. No acknowledgement. Just silence stretching long enough that Felix began preparing a formal complaint to the state's HOA regulatory division. The kind of filing that triggers actual government review of an association's conduct. During that silence, something small but telling happened. My neighbor's teenage son, who mowed lawns around the neighborhood for spending money, mentioned offhand that he'd seen a truck from Voss Property Solutions idling near the drainage creek behind the Greenbelt late one evening. Workers unloading equipment that looked, to him, like pumps. I filed that detail away, uneasy but unsure what it meant, and mentioned it to Trent during our next call. He went quiet for a moment, then asked me to check the pond's water level first thing the next morning, just as a precaution. I didn't sleep well that night, turning the comment over. The next morning, the pond looked normal, same level, same turtles sunning on the rock, Gus paddling lazily toward me for breakfast. I felt almost silly for worrying. But Trent asked me to start taking a daily photo anyway, time-stamped, just to establish a clean baseline. It seemed excessive. 3 days later, Denise called me at 7 in the morning, voice tight. The HOA had just posted an emergency notice. Mandatory drainage maintenance scheduled for the creek behind the Greenbelt, effective immediately, citing county infrastructure coordination. No public comment period. No advance notice beyond the posting itself. Approved. The notice said, by Board President Karen Voss. I drove straight to the Greenbelt and found exactly what the teenager had described. Pumps, hoses, 2 contractors in Voss Property Solutions polos, positioned at the exact bend in the creek that fed groundwater toward my property line. When I asked what they were doing, one shrugged. Just following the work order. Ma'am, I called Trent immediately, standing in the greenbelt with my phone shaking slightly in my hand. He was quiet for a long moment, then said something that turned my worry into something closer to fury. Dana, if they alter groundwater flow to that pond right now, mid-assessment, that could functionally destroy documented habitat. Can they even do that? I asked. Creek work. On land that isn't private property. Trent's answer was careful. Technically, the creek might be within an easement the HOA controls. But if it affects a site under active state habitat review, especially one with a confirmed species of concern, that crosses into very different legal territory. I called Felix from the Greenbelt, and within 20 minutes, he'd sent an emergency email to the board, the county, and, at Trent's suggestion, the State Wildlife Agency's regional office, all copied simultaneously, documenting the ongoing work and explicitly flagging its potential impact on a site currently under formal habitat assessment. The contractors kept working through the morning, seemingly unaware or unbothered by the emails flying above their heads. But by early afternoon, a state wildlife officer named Renata Cho called me directly. She'd received Felix's email, cross-referenced it with Trent's open assessment file, and was, in her words, very interested in what's happening down there. Officer Cho arrived at the Greenbelt within the hour, badge visible, asking the contractors detailed questions about work orders, permits, and whether anyone had assessed the site for protected species before beginning. The lead contractor, visibly uncomfortable, admitted he'd simply been told by Karen personally that the work was routine and pre-approved. Pre-approved by whom? Officer Cho asked. Pen ready. The contractor didn't have an answer beyond Karen's name. Cho ordered the work halted immediately, pending a formal site review, and informed him, loudly enough for several onlooking neighbors to hear, that unauthorized habitat disturbance during an active assessment could carry real legal consequences. Word spread through Chestnut Hollow Court faster than any newsletter Karen had ever sent. By evening, half the neighborhood group chat was speculating about what exactly had happened at the Greenbelt, and why a state wildlife officer had been standing there with a clipboard, ordering HOA-hired contractors to shut down their equipment. Karen's response, posted publicly to the group chat around 8 that night, was defensive and strange. She claimed the drainage work was essential maintenance, unrelated to any private resident's landscaping hobby, and accused unnamed residents of escalating a routine matter into a manufactured crisis for personal reasons. Nobody replied. The silence felt loud. I didn't sleep much that night either. Replaying the day, the pumps, the officer's clipboard, Karen's strange, defensive message. Something had cracked open, visibly, publicly, in a way her usual gavel-banging and confident letterhead couldn't paper over. For the first time since this began, I felt the ground shifting under her instead of me. The following week brought a formal letter from the State Wildlife Agency, addressed to both me and the HOA board, confirming that the site had been placed under expedited review following the halted drainage work, and that any further habitat disturbance without clearance could result in fines or referral for further investigation. Trent called to walk me through it, clearly energized. This is significant, Dana. They don't expedite review for nothing. Combined with what Officer Cho witnessed, This puts real teeth behind the assessment. He paused. How's the HOA taking it? I told him about Karen's group chat message. He laughed. A short, disbelieving sound. Felix, meanwhile, used the halted drainage incident as fresh ammunition in his ongoing complaint to the state's HOA regulatory division, adding it as evidence of a pattern. Invented bylaw enforcement, denied financial records, unauthorized property intrusion, and now, potentially unauthorized environmental disturbance during an active wildlife review. The file was growing thick. At the next board meeting, Karen tried to control the narrative from the opening gavel, framing the halted creek work as an overcautious government overreaction and promising residents that normal maintenance would resume once the confusion clears. She did not mention Officer Cho by name. She did not mention my pond by name either. But Denise stood up before Karen could move to the next agenda item and asked, plainly, whether the board had authorized the creek work through a proper vote, as required by the bylaws for expenditures over a certain threshold. Karen said the board chair had emergency authority for maintenance matters. Denise asked to see that provision in writing. Karen said she'd circle back on that. She did not circle back. Instead, she abruptly moved to adjourn the meeting 20 minutes early, citing a scheduling conflict, gaveling the room silent before several raised hands, including mine, could be acknowledged. Neighbors filed out murmuring, more unsettled than they'd been walking in. In the parking lot afterward, Walt caught up with me again, this time with something new, a name. His cousin, turned out, had lived in a different HOA community 2 counties over. One Karen had briefly served on the board of years earlier, before moving to Chestnut Hollow. You should look into what happened there, he said. I mentioned it to Felix, who was intrigued enough to do some digging through public records and old local newspaper archives. What he found took 2 days to fully compile, and when he finally called me with it, his voice had the careful, measured tone of someone who knew he was handing over something serious. Karen had served on the board of Willowmere Estates HOA 9 years earlier, and had resigned abruptly midterm following a state audit triggered by resident complaints. Complaints eerily similar to ours, involving invented violations, denied financial records, and a landscaping contract awarded to a company later found to have overbilled the association by tens of thousands of dollars. The audit report, a public document Felix had pulled directly from the state's records portal, didn't name Karen as personally responsible for the overbilling, but it did note significant governance concerns regarding board oversight and vendor selection practices during her tenure, and recommended the association implement stricter financial controls going forward. It wasn't a smoking gun by itself, audits rarely are, but it was a pattern stretching back nearly a decade. The same shape repeating itself in a different zip code. Invented enforcement, opaque finances, a conveniently connected contractor, and a president who resigned quietly the moment scrutiny arrived, only to reappear somewhere new. I sat with that information for a long time before deciding what to do with it. Part of me wanted to post it immediately, publicly, and watch Karen's carefully constructed authority collapse in real time. Felix, characteristically cautious, urged patience again. Save it, he said. Trust me. So I waited, folder growing heavier, documentation piling up, the invalid bylaw amendment, the halted creek work, the denied financial records, the Willowmere audit, and now, quietly, officer chose ongoing habitat review, closing in on its conclusion. Every thread, on its own, was concerning. Together, they were beginning to look undeniable. 2 weeks later, Trent called with news that made my hands genuinely shake. The State Wildlife Agency had completed its formal site assessment and confirmed the pond as active habitat for spotted turtles, a species of special concern, with documented breeding evidence. A formal habitat designation letter was being drafted and would be issued within days. What does the designation actually mean? Practically, I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Trent explained carefully. The site would be recorded with specific habitat protections attached to the property, restricting certain alterations without agency review. And, because the site connected to a documented wetland corridor, potential federal review under related conservation provisions. In plain terms, he said, nobody can drain, fill, or significantly disturb that pond without going through us first. Not a contractor. Not without real consequences. I laughed, a sound somewhere between disbelief and relief, and thanked him more times than was probably necessary. He just said, "You did the hard part. You noticed." I called Felix immediately, and this time, even he allowed himself a small note of triumph in his voice. "This changes everything," he said. "Once that designation is official, every fine, every violation notice, every threat of removal against that pond becomes not just wrong, but potentially unlawful interference with protected habitat. We have real leverage now." We decided together, once the official letter arrived, we wouldn't announce it quietly through Felix's usual careful correspondence. We'd bring it to the next board meeting, in person, in front of every neighbor who'd sat through months of Karen's gavel-banging certainty. Some things needed a room full of witnesses to really land. The official designation letter arrived on a Wednesday. Embossed state letterhead. Precise legal language confirming what Trent had already told me. Protected habitat status. Documented species presence. Restrictions on disturbance without agency clearance. I read it 4 times at my kitchen table, then called Rob at work just to hear him say "holy hell" out loud. That same week, almost as if some cosmic sense of timing had decided Karen deserved no further peace, Denise's husband finally received a partial breakthrough on the financial records. Request, not from Karen, but from the HOA's outside accountant, who, uncomfortable with the ongoing regulatory complaint, quietly provided documents through a separate legal channel. The documents confirmed what Walt had suspected. Voss Property Solutions had been awarded 3 consecutive no-bid landscaping contracts since Karen took office, each renewed without competing quotes, totaling nearly $200,000 over 3 years, a sum that lined up almost exactly with the special assessments residents had been quietly funding. Denise forwarded the documents to Felix, who cross-referenced them against association bylaws requiring competitive bidding above a certain dollar threshold, a requirement that had apparently been temporarily suspended by board vote during Karen's first year, a vote for which, once again, no properly filed minutes could be located anywhere in HOA records. The picture was no longer speculative. It was documented, dated, cross-referenced, and sitting in 3 separate folders: mine, Denise's, and now Felix's consolidated master file. Karen hadn't just been an overzealous rule enforcer. She'd built, quietly and methodically, a small closed system where she controlled enforcement, finance, and the narrative all at once. I felt something shift in myself that week too. Less anxious dread walking into HOA meetings. More of a steady, focused calm. The kind that comes from knowing you're not the one hiding anything. For months, Karen had made me feel like the problem. Now, for the first time, I understood exactly who the problem actually was. The next board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and word had somehow spread through the group chat, through cul-de-sac conversations, through Walt's careful network of quietly furious retirees, that something significant might happen. The clubhouse, usually half empty, filled almost to capacity, folding chairs dragged in from a storage closet. Karen noticed the turnout the moment she walked in, and something flickered across her face before the practiced composure settled back into place. She opened the meeting exactly as always: community wins. A new note about mailbox flag colors, as though sheer procedural normalcy could hold back whatever the room was bracing for. I let her finish the routine business first. Patient in a way that would have been unimaginable to me 8 months earlier. Before the pond. Before Trent. Before I understood that documentation, delivered calmly, hits harder than anger ever could. When she finally reached new business, I stood and asked to address the board. Karen's jaw tightened, but with the room this full, gaveling me down without explanation would have looked exactly like what it was. She nodded, tight and clipped, and said I'd have 3 minutes. Per standard procedure, a procedure. I noted aloud, that had never once been enforced against her own lengthy opening remarks. I began simply. I held up the State Wildlife Agency's official letter and read the key line aloud. Confirmed habitat for a state-protected species. Formal restrictions on disturbance without agency clearance. A murmur moved through the room. Karen's face didn't change, but her hand, resting on the gavel, went very still. I explained, calmly and without embellishment, the timeline, the disclosed pond, the invalid 2019 amendment, months of fines based on that invalid amendment, the unauthorized contractor visit, and finally the halted creek work that had triggered Officer Cho's involvement in the first place. Every fact I stated, I had paperwork for. I said so. Then I nodded toward Denise, who stood and calmly laid out the financial side, 3 no-bid contracts to Voss Property Solutions, the suspiciously timed bylaw suspension that made them possible, and the special assessments residents had paid, unknowingly, to fund contracts awarded to the HOA president's own brother-in-law's company. The room went very quiet. Walt stood next, older voice steady despite the tremor of age in it, and mentioned Willowmere Estates, the prior HOA, the audit, the eerily similar pattern, the quiet resignation right as scrutiny arrived. He didn't accuse Karen of anything directly. He simply laid the timeline beside our own and let the room draw its own conclusion. Karen finally spoke, voice tighter than I'd ever heard it, insisting this was a coordinated attack and a gross mischaracterization of routine governance decisions, and that the Willowmere audit had cleared her of any wrongdoing. Felix, seated quietly in the back, stood and clarified, gently but precisely, that the audit had recommended governance reforms, not cleared anyone. I have the actual report, he said, holding up a folder. If the board would like to review the language directly, rather than Karen's summary of it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Doing the math themselves. And the sum wasn't landing anywhere good for Karen. one of the two quiet board members, a soft-spoken man named Arthur who'd rarely spoken at any meeting I'd attended, finally raised his hand and asked, haltingly, whether the board had ever actually seen the competitive bid waivers Karen claimed had been properly voted on.
Karen said the paperwork was in storage.
It's been 3 years, Arthur said, quiet but audible in the now-silent clubhouse. Karen, I don't remember voting on that. The other quiet board member, a woman named Priscilla, nodded slowly beside him, not saying anything, but the nod itself was its own kind of answer, and everyone in the room clocked it. Karen tried to regain control, insisting the meeting was devolving into a personal attack, and moving to adjourn early, gavel already rising toward the table. But this time, someone in the crowd, I never saw exactly who, called out second the motion to instead extend discussion. A procedural maneuver Felix had quietly briefed a few of us on. Robert's rules. Turned out, technically allowed a motion to extend discussion time to override a president's attempt to adjourn, provided a quorum supported it, and, with the room this full, this angry, this suddenly paying close attention to procedure for the first time in years, the motion passed by an overwhelming show of hands. Karen stood there, gavel frozen mid-air, visibly recalculating in real time. For 3 years, control of the room had rested entirely on residents not knowing the rules well enough to challenge her. That evening, in front of nearly 80 neighbors, that particular illusion finally, audibly, cracked. I watched something shift across her face. Not quite panic, not yet, but the first genuine flicker of a woman realizing the story she'd been telling herself, and everyone else, for years might not survive contact with an actual attentive audience. She sat down slowly, gavel resting untouched on the table for the rest of the meeting. The meeting ran another 90 minutes past its usual length. Residents asking pointed questions Karen increasingly struggled to answer, about the missing meeting minutes, the unfiled amendment, the sudden creek work timed suspiciously close to my pond's protection review. Each unanswered question chipped further away at the authority she'd spent years carefully constructing. Toward the end, Denise formally proposed a motion, an independent, board external financial audit, funded by the association, covering the past 3 years, with results to be shared fully and publicly with all residents. The motion passed, overwhelmingly, with only Karen and one silent abstention voting against it. It wasn't over. Karen left the clubhouse that night without her usual lingering small talk, without her usual reminder about mailbox flag colors, walking quickly to her car with her cardigan pulled tight despite the mild evening. I didn't feel triumphant watching her go, mostly just tired, and cautiously, carefully hopeful, in a way I hadn't let myself feel in months. Rob was waiting up when I got home, and I told him everything, start to finish, watching relief slowly replace the tension he'd been carrying quietly all these months right alongside me. So it's basically over, he said. I hesitated. Karen wasn't the type to simply let this end on someone else's terms. I was right to hesitate. An anonymous complaint was filed with the County Code Enforcement Office, alleging my pond violated unpermitted excavation rules unrelated to the HOA entirely, a separate government channel Karen apparently still had access to, or at least knew how to weaponize, even with her HOA authority crumbling. Felix wasn't surprised when I called him, frustrated and exhausted. "This is common," he said. "Calm as ever. When people like this lose one lever, they reach for another." He immediately requested the complaint file, and within a day confirmed what we both suspected. The complainant's contact information traced back to a burner email registered the same week. The county inspector who came out, a straightforward woman named Rosalind Pratt, walked my property with a clipboard and, after 20 minutes, told me plainly that the pond fell well within acceptable parameters for residential water features, especially now bolstered by state habitat documentation. "Honestly," she added, "this looks like a bad faith complaint to me." I asked, carefully, whether bad faith code complaints carried any consequences. Rosalind said repeated frivolous complaints could result in the county declining to investigate future reports from the same source, and, in cases of clear harassment, could theoretically support a civil claim. She wasn't accusing anyone by name, but her eyebrow said plenty. That same week, Priya messaged me something unsettling. Her elderly mother, who occasionally house-sat next door, had noticed an unfamiliar car parked near my house twice in the past week. Engine running, someone inside seemingly watching the property. She hadn't gotten a plate number, just a vague description. Silver sedan, a woman driving. I mentioned it to Felix, who suggested, gently but firmly, that I start keeping a simple log of anything unusual: cars, visits, calls, not out of paranoia, but because patterns matter legally, and a single odd sighting means little while a documented pattern means quite a lot, especially layered onto everything else already building. 3 days later, my home security camera caught something concrete. A woman matching the silver sedan description, standing at the edge of my property near the arborvitae. Phone raised, clearly photographing the backyard pond from an angle just barely visible past the fence line. The footage was grainy, but the cardigan was unmistakably Karen's. I sat with that footage for a long time before deciding what to do. Part of me wanted to confront her directly. Felix, once again, counseled patience. Save it, timestamp it, let it join the folder rather than the group chat, at least until we understood what exactly Karen thought photographing my backyard would accomplish. We found out soon enough. At the State Wildlife Agency, alleging that I had artificially introduced the turtles to fraudulently manufacture a protected habitat claim, a serious accusation, since fabricating wildlife evidence to obstruct property enforcement would be considered fraud, and would have unraveled everything Trent's team had documented. Officer Cho called me directly, professional but clearly wanting to understand the allegation's origin. I explained everything: Gus, the original rescue turtle, and the others who'd simply arrived on their own over 2 years, well before any HOA dispute existed. She said the agency would need to formally verify the claim. Standard procedure. Nothing personal. My stomach dropped anyway. Months of careful documentation, Trent's expertise, the state's own confirmed assessment, all of it now shadowed by a single anonymous accusation, timed suspiciously close to a woman photographing my backyard from behind an arborvitae hedge. I called Trent immediately, voice tighter than I wanted it to be. Trent, to his credit, wasn't rattled. "This is actually good for you." "Weirdly," he said. "We have dated photographs going back 2 years. My original assessment notes. And Biscuit's confirmed shell pattern predates any dispute with your HOA by months." Fabrication claims fall apart fast against a real paper trail. We have one. They did not. Verification. Completed within a week. Found no evidence supporting the fabrication claim, and specifically noted that the earliest documented photograph of Biscuit, a casual snapshot I'd taken the week she first arrived, timestamped automatically by my phone, predated any HOA dispute by nearly a year. Officer Cho's follow-up call carried a new note in her voice, something closer to genuine irritation on my behalf. Whoever filed that tip either didn't understand how thorough our documentation process is, she said, or didn't think you'd have receipts. Either way, I'd encourage you to keep me updated on anything else unusual happening over there. I asked, cautiously, whether false wildlife reports carried any consequences of their own. She confirmed that knowingly filing a false report with a state wildlife agency could constitute a misdemeanor under certain circumstances, particularly if it appeared intended to obstruct an active investigation or habitat protection process. I thanked her and hung up, hands finally steady. Karen's escalation, rather than intimidating me the way it clearly intended to, had instead handed us something new, a second false accusation, layered onto the false code complaint, layered onto the surveillance footage, layered onto the halted creek work and the unfiled amendments and the no-bid contracts. The folder was no longer thick. It was enormous. Felix, reviewing everything together one evening at his office, finally said the sentence I'd been half expecting for weeks. Dana, at this point, we're not just talking about disputing fines anymore. Between the trespassing, the false reports, the financial irregularities, and the apparent surveillance, you may have grounds for a genuine civil claim, if you want one. I sat with that for a long moment. Part of me, tired and worn thin from months of fighting, just wanted the harassment to stop. But another part, the part that had watched my 11-year-old ask why Mrs. Voss hated our turtles, wanted something closer to accountability. I told Felix the first needed a few days to think. During those few days, something happened that made the decision considerably easier. Denise called, breathless, having just received the first partial results from the independent financial audit the board had voted for weeks earlier. The auditor's preliminary letter flagged significant concerns requiring immediate board response, specifically around vendor contracts and missing meeting documentation. The audit had uncovered something none of us had fully anticipated. Nearly $30,000 in HOA reserve funds transferred over 18 months to an account.
Linked not to Voss Property Solutions, but to a separate, personal LLC registered under Karen's own name, listed in filings only as administrative and consulting services.
Nobody on the board, according to the auditor's notes, could produce any record of a vote authorizing these consulting payments, any contract describing what services were actually rendered, or any invoice detailing the work performed. $30,000, moving quietly from community reserves into Karen's personal company, with essentially no paper trail justifying any of it. Denise's voice shook slightly, reading me the summary over the phone. Dana, this isn't just bad governance anymore. This might be actual embezzlement. I sat down hard on my kitchen steps, staring out at the pond, at Gus paddling lazily in the evening light, and felt the full, dizzying scale of what we'd stumbled into. Felix, when I called him immediately after, was quiet for a long moment, unusual for him, before saying carefully that misappropriation of HOA funds could constitute a serious crime, depending on the amounts and intent involved, and that the auditor would likely be legally obligated to refer significant findings to law enforcement or the state attorney general's office. This isn't a civil dispute over your pond anymore, he added. If this holds up, Karen could be looking at criminal exposure. I need you to understand, once this moves in that direction, it's largely out of our hands as private citizens. But everything you've documented, all of it, just became extremely relevant evidence. I barely slept that night, turning it all over: the fines, the arborvitae photograph, the false wildlife report, and now $30,000 quietly siphoned from neighbors who'd paid special assessments believing every dollar funded actual landscaping. Karen hadn't just been enforcing invented rules. She'd been running something far more calculated, far longer than any of us realized. The independent auditor, per state regulations governing HOA financial reviews, formally referred the findings to the county district attorney's office within days, flagging potential embezzlement and financial fraud. Officer Cho's ongoing habitat case and the false wildlife report allegation were separately noted as relevant context in the broader pattern of conduct being reviewed. Karen, notably, went quiet for nearly 2 weeks, no group chat messages, no new violation notices, no HOA newsletter. The clubhouse sat unusually still. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I found myself almost unsettled by the silence, half expecting it to be the calm before something worse rather than something better. It was, in fact, both. On a Wednesday afternoon, while I was picking my kids up from school, Priya called, voice urgent, saying I needed to get home immediately, that a Voss property solutions truck had pulled up to my house again, this time with 2 large containers and equipment that looked unmistakably like it was meant for draining. I broke every speed limit I'm willing to admit to, arriving home to find 2 contractors already unloading hoses near the pond's edge. Karen herself standing in my driveway, arms crossed, telling them to move quickly. We don't have much time. No notice. No hearing. Just Karen, apparently deciding to finish this herself. Immediately. What are you doing? I demanded. Phone already in hand. Recording. Karen's composure, usually so carefully maintained, had visibly frayed, hair slightly disheveled, voice sharper and less controlled than I'd ever heard it. Ending this, she snapped. This pond has caused nothing but problems since the day you built it. It ends today. You don't have authorization to be on my property, I said, keeping my voice level despite my heart hammering. This pond is under active state habitat protection. If you touch it, you're not violating an HOA bylaw anymore. You're violating state and potentially federal wildlife law. Karen laughed, short and brittle. That's not going to stop me. I called Officer Cho directly, on speakerphone, loud enough for Karen and the contractors to hear every word. Cho's response was immediate and sharp. Unauthorized disturbance of a confirmed protected habitat site was a serious violation. Law enforcement was being contacted right now, and everyone on the property needed to stop all activity immediately. The contractors, to their credit, stopped instantly, exchanging uneasy glances, clearly reconsidering whatever Karen had promised or pressured them into believing was routine. Karen, however, didn't stop. She grabbed a hose herself, moving toward the pond's edge with a kind of desperate, unraveling determination I'd never seen from her before. "Karen." "Stop," I said, stepping between her and the water, close enough now to see her hands actually shaking. "Whatever this is about, it's not about my pond anymore, is it?" Something in her face cracked, just slightly, just for a second, before the anger rushed back in to cover it. "You have no idea what you've done," she said, voice suddenly raw in a way that startled me more than her anger ever had. 30 years I've built this life, this reputation, and you and your ridiculous turtles are going to take it all away over a backyard hobby. The mask, finally, was fully off. A county sheriff's cruiser pulled into my driveway less than 10 minutes later, responding to Officer Cho's call, followed shortly by Officer Cho herself, arriving in an official state vehicle. Karen stood frozen by the pond's edge, hose still in hand, contractors already backing toward their truck, clearly wanting no further part in whatever this had become. The deputy asked Karen to step away from the water and identify herself. She did, voice tight, still insisting this was a misunderstanding regarding routine association maintenance. Officer Cho, stepping forward with her own documentation in hand, corrected her plainly. This site had been under formal protected status for weeks. Notification had been sent to the HOA board directly. "You received that notification personally," Cho said, checking her file. "Certified mail. Delivered 11 days ago. Signature confirmed as K. Voss." Karen's face went pale. Whatever excuse she'd been building collapsed in real time, in front of a deputy, an officer, 2 increasingly nervous contractors, and me. Phone still recording every second of it. The deputy, after conferring briefly with Officer Cho, informed Karen that her actions could constitute a violation of state wildlife protection statutes, and that the matter would be formally documented and forwarded for review alongside the ongoing embezzlement referral already sitting with the district attorney's office. Karen said nothing. I stood on my own front lawn, phone finally lowered, watching Karen Voss, HOA president, gavel wielder, architect of 3 years of invented rules and quiet retaliation, standing, pale and silent in my driveway while a sheriff's deputy took her statement. Contractors packed up and used equipment, and my turtles paddled, entirely unbothered, in the pond behind us. Officer Cho approached me afterward, her expression somewhere between professional and quietly satisfied. "This footage, combined with the earlier documented incidents, is going to matter a great deal," she said. "I'd recommend preserving everything exactly as it is. This just went from a habitat concern to a potential criminal case." I nodded, still slightly numb. Karen left in her own car that afternoon. Not arrested. Not yet. But clearly understanding that whatever remained of her authority, HOA, reputation, the version of herself she'd spent years carefully constructing had just publicly, undeniably collapsed in a driveway in front of witnesses, a deputy, a state officer, and a fully recorded video. By evening, the footage had somehow already reached the neighborhood group chat, forwarded from Priya's mother, who'd watched the entire confrontation unfold from her window. Within an hour, it had spread further still, neighbors sending it to neighbors, disbelief and vindication mixing together in a stream of messages I mostly couldn't bring myself to read that night. Denise called first, voice somewhere between shock and something close to triumph. "Dana, I don't think you understand what you just did," she said. "You didn't just protect your pond. You just gave every single person this woman ever fined, threatened, or lied to actual proof of who she really is." I hadn't thought of it that way yet. Rob found me sitting quietly by the pond that evening. Kids already asleep, turtles settling into their nighttime stillness along the rock. "You okay?" he asked, sitting down beside me. I told him honestly, I felt strange, hollowed out in a way, less triumphant than simply, finally, exhausted in a way that felt earned rather than defeated. "It's not over yet, though," I added, watching Gus's shell catch the last of the porch light. "The DA still has to decide what to do with the embezzlement referral. The HOA board still has to figure out what happens next. And Karen's still out there, presumably furious, presumably not done." Rob just nodded, squeezing my hand. He wasn't wrong to expect more, though what came next arrived faster than any of us anticipated. 2 days after the driveway confrontation, the county district attorney's office announced it was formally opening a criminal investigation into Karen Voss, citing both the financial audit referral and the newly documented habitat violation incident as contributing factors. The local news picked it up within a day, a short segment, mostly focused on the embezzlement angle, briefly mentioning an unusual habitat protection dispute as a contributing thread. They didn't use my name. I was grateful for that. Honestly, having had quite enough public attention over the preceding months to last several years. Karen, according to Denise's admittedly excellent informal information network, had retained a criminal defense attorney within 48 hours and had not attended, nor sent any representative to, the emergency HOA board meeting called specifically to address her status as president. Following the criminal investigation announcement and mounting resident pressure for her removal, that emergency meeting, held the following Monday, drew the largest crowd Chestnut Hollow Court's clubhouse had ever seen. Folding chairs borrowed from 3 different closets, people standing along the back wall, a level of civic engagement the neighborhood hadn't managed for anything short of, apparently, a president's public unraveling. Arthur, the previously quiet board member, chaired the meeting in Karen's absence, visibly uncomfortable but steady, walking residents through the formal process for removing a sitting HOA president under the association's bylaws, a process, notably, that had never once been used in the community's history, because no prior president had ever required it. The vote, when it finally came, wasn't close. Of the residents present and eligible to vote, the overwhelming majority supported Karen's immediate removal from the board, pending the outcome of both the criminal investigation and a separate internal review of every fine, assessment, and violation notice issued during her 3-year tenure as president. Priscilla, the other quiet board member, resigned that same evening, tearfully admitting she'd voted alongside Karen on several contested measures without fully understanding their financial implications, trusting Karen's presentation of the facts rather than reviewing documentation herself. Nobody in the room seemed inclined to hold that against her too harshly. Trust, misplaced, wasn't the same as complicity. Arthur was elected interim president that same night, on the spot, with Denise and Walt both volunteering to join the board as well. A slate of residents, notably, who'd spent the past several months actually reading bylaws, requesting records, and asking uncomfortable questions rather than simply trusting whoever held the gavel. Felix helped draft the board's first official act under new leadership, a full, formal review of every fine and violation notice issued under the invalid 2019 bylaw amendment, with automatic reversal and refund for any affected household. My family's $1,400 in fines, still technically outstanding, was wiped clean within the week. Walt's koi pond, Priya's wind chime fine, Denise's garden gnomes, dozens of small, previously unresolved grievances, some going back years, were finally, formally reviewed and, in most cases, reversed. It wasn't dramatic the way the driveway confrontation had been. It was quieter, steadier, the slow work of actual, functioning governance finally returning. The formal state habitat designation for my pond was recorded permanently with the county within the month, meaning no future HOA board, whatever their intentions, could ever again threaten to drain, fill, or disturb it without running headlong into the same state and potentially federal protections that had ultimately unraveled Karen's entire scheme. Trent visited one last time that summer, mostly for a follow-up survey, but also, he admitted, because he'd genuinely grown fond of checking in on Gus and Biscuit. He counted 6 turtles that day, 2 new arrivals since spring. Healthy, growing population, he said, grinning. You built something real here, whether you meant to or not. I told him I definitely hadn't meant to become an accidental wildlife conservationist in the middle of an HOA war, and he laughed, packing up his field notebook. Most good habitat protection starts exactly like this, he said.
Somebody just refusing to let something small.
The district attorney's investigation, over the following months, moved with the particular slowness of these things, but steadily. Forensic accountants traced the full $32,000 eventually confirmed missing, matched against invoices that either didn't exist or described services never actually performed. Karen's attorney, according to public filings, began discussing a potential plea agreement by early autumn. I wasn't there for the plea hearing, 6 months after the driveway confrontation, but Denise attended and called me immediately afterward. Karen had pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of misappropriation of association funds, agreed to full restitution, and received a sentence involving probation, community service, and notably a formal prohibition from serving on any HOA board for 10 years. The habitat disturbance incident ultimately resulted in a separate civil citation and fine under state wildlife protection statutes, rather than criminal charges, given the confrontation had been halted before any actual harm occurred to the pond or its residents. Still, it remained permanently on record, a documented, undeniable violation with her name attached. Karen sold her house on Chestnut Hollow Court that winter, moving away quietly, without the neighborhood send-off usually afforded departing residents. Nobody organized a farewell casserole. Nobody, as far as I know, particularly missed the sound of her gavel, or the particular dread of finding a certified letter waiting in the mailbox. I felt, when I heard she'd left, an unexpected complexity of emotion, not quite triumph, not quite pity, something closer to a tired, resigned understanding that people who build their sense of power on controlling others eventually run out of rooms willing to let them. She'd find a new one, probably, just not ours. Walt, months later, mentioned hearing through his cousin's grapevine that Karen had attempted, briefly, to get involved with a homeowners committee in her new town, an informal one, not even a formal HOA, and had been quietly, firmly discouraged from continuing after only a few weeks. Old habits. Apparently, travel poorly once exposed. Life on Chestnut Hollow Court. Meanwhile, settled into something I hadn't realized I'd missed. Genuine neighborliness. Meetings that ran on time and covered real, boring, functional business. A board that actually answered records requests within the legally required window instead of inventing confidentiality policies on the spot. Arthur, now formally elected president rather than interim, ran the HOA with a kind of unglamorous competence that felt, after 3 years of Karen, almost radical in its simplicity. He answered emails, and promptly. He asked for resident input before major decisions. Nobody found this remarkable except by contrast. My pond, meanwhile, thrived, turtles basking undisturbed, goldfish multiplying steadily, my kids spending long summer evenings cataloging new arrivals with a level of enthusiasm that occasionally bordered on obsessive. My daughter, now 12, had taken to keeping her own small notebook, inspired entirely by Trent, tracking shell patterns like a junior field biologist. She asked me once, sitting by the water on a warm evening, why Mrs. Voss had hated the turtles so much in the first place. I thought about it for a long moment before answering honestly. I don't think she hated the turtles, I said. I think she hated anything she couldn't control. The turtles just happened to be in the way. That answer seemed to satisfy her. In the particular way 12-year-olds accept explanations that are true without needing them fully unpacked. She went back to her notebook, carefully sketching Biscuit's star-patterned shell, while Gus paddled lazy circles nearby, entirely indifferent to the months of chaos his small, quiet pond had somehow set in motion. Trent's habitat assessment, formally published the following spring as part of a broader regional study on spotted turtle populations, cited our pond specifically as a notable example of incidental urban habitat formation, a case study. He told me proudly that other wildlife biologists were now referencing when discussing suburban conservation opportunities. I found that strangely moving, in a way I hadn't expected, that something born from a 9-year-old backyard hobby, nearly destroyed by one woman's need for absolute control, had instead become documented, published, permanently protected proof that sometimes the smallest, most stubborn refusals to back down ripple outward further than anyone could have predicted. Felix closed out our case file that spring as well, sending a final invoice considerably smaller than either of us had expected given everything that had unfolded. Cases like this don't come around often, he told me on our last call. Most people fold before it gets anywhere close to this far. I'm glad you didn't. I asked him, half joking, whether he'd ever handled anything quite like it before. An HOA dispute that ended in embezzlement charges, a federal-adjacent wildlife designation, and a sheriff's deputy standing in someone's driveway. He laughed. Yes, he admitted. Usually it's just a fence dispute. You gave me a career highlight. The neighborhood, collectively, seemed to settle into a kind of cautious, hard-won trust in its own governance again. Residents attending meetings not out of dread but out of genuine, if occasionally boring, civic interest. board members actually reading the bylaws they were meant to enforce rather than inventing new ones as convenient. Denise ran successfully for board secretary the following year, campaigning, half-jokingly, on a platform of answering your emails within 5 business days. I promise. She won by a landslide. Priya's wind chimes, restored to their rightful place on her porch, tinkled pleasantly through the summer without a single violation notice in sight. Walt, well into his 70s, took to attending every single meeting anyway, less out of necessity now and more, he admitted, because he genuinely enjoyed watching the neighborhood function properly for once. Spent years assuming this was just how HOAs were. He told me one afternoon.
Turns out it was just...
I thought about that sentence often in the months that followed. How easily a single person's need for control can masquerade as simply how things are, until enough people,
quietly and separately, start comparing notes and realize the Emperor's gavel never actually had any real authority behind it beyond everyone's collective, exhausted compliance.
My own relationship with the pond changed too, in subtler ways. What had once been a simple backyard hobby now carried a kind of quiet significance. Not just a place my kids caught fireflies, but documented, protected habitat, a small stubborn ecosystem that had somehow outlasted every attempt to erase it. I started volunteering occasionally with Trent's regional conservation group, mostly just helping catalog sightings from other backyard ponds and creeks around the county. Homeowners who'd noticed their own unexpected turtle visitors and, thanks in small part to our very public saga, now knew exactly who to call before assuming it meant nothing. One woman, calling from 2 towns over, told me she'd found our story through a local news segment and wanted to know whether her own backyard creek might qualify for similar protection. I gave her Trent's number, feeling an odd, quiet satisfaction. The fight that had nearly worn me down entirely was now, somehow, helping someone else before theirs even really began. Rob liked to joke, especially at dinner parties, that our family had accidentally become minor local celebrities for the turtle thing. A label I mostly deflected with embarrassed laughter, though I'll admit there was a small, private pride in it too, proof that stubbornness, properly documented, occasionally does actually change something. My daughter's school even asked me to speak briefly at a career day event the following spring. Not about my actual job, but about standing up for what's right. A framing that felt slightly grandiose for what had, at its core, simply been refusing to drain a pond because someone with a gavel told me to. I kept the speech simple for the kids, no embezzlement details, no driveway confrontations, just the basic shape of it. Sometimes people in charge are wrong, I told them. Sometimes proving it takes patience, paperwork, and asking for help from people who actually know more than you do. Most of them seemed more interested in the turtle photos. Gus, remarkably, was still going strong that year, paddling his familiar morning circuit toward whoever showed up with breakfast, entirely unaware that his quiet pond had briefly become the center of a genuine local scandal, a criminal investigation, and, apparently, a modest local legend among the parents at my daughter's school. Biscuit, the spotted turtle who'd started it all, laid her first documented clutch of eggs that following spring, carefully monitored by Trent's team with the kind of quiet excitement usually reserved for far rarer events. This is exactly why habitat protection matters, he told me, crouched at the pond's edge, genuinely thrilled. This is the whole point, watching him carefully document the nest site, I found myself thinking back to that first certified letter, the one demanding I drain my pond within 30 days or submit retroactive plans for board approval. How close, if I'd simply complied quietly the way so many others had over the years, we'd have come to losing all of this. I mentioned that thought to Felix once, near the end of our working relationship, half rhetorical, mostly just processing out loud. What if I just paid the fine and drained it? I said. He considered it seriously before answering. Then Karen keeps going, he said simply. Someone else's pond, someone else's fence, someone else's hobby. Until somebody didn't fold. That answer stuck with me longer than I expected. It wasn't really about the pond. In the end, not entirely, it was about the particular, quiet courage of simply refusing to disappear when someone with a little borrowed authority decides you should. Karen had counted on exhaustion. She hadn't counted on documentation, or turtles, or neighbors finally comparing notes. The following autumn, nearly a year and a half after that first certified letter arrived, our HOA held its annual community picnic, an event Karen had, in prior years, turned into a fairly rigid, checklist-driven affair, complete with approved food categories and a strict schedule. Under Arthur's leadership, it became, simply, picnic again. Neighbors brought whatever dishes they wanted. Kids ran wherever they pleased. Someone brought a folding table specifically for people to leave positive notes about board members. A small, almost defiant gesture of appreciation after years of dreading every piece of HOA correspondence that landed in anyone's mailbox. I brought a small poster board, at my daughter's insistent suggestion, with photos of the pond's turtles, growing steadily in number, a few printouts of Trent's published habitat study, and a simple handwritten sign, "Ask me about our accidental protected wetland." More neighbors stopped to talk than I expected, several with pond stories of their own. Denise found me there, laughing, holding a paper plate precariously balanced with 3 different casseroles. "You know," she said, "if you told me 18 months ago that a Goldfish pond would end with an HOA president pleading guilty to embezzlement, I genuinely would not have believed a single word of it." I told her I wouldn't have either. Walt, holding court near the dessert table as usual, told anyone who'd listen his own slightly exaggerated version of the driveway confrontation, embellishing details each time in a way that made me laugh rather than correct him. Some stories, I decided, deserved to become neighborhood legend, even if the truth was slightly less cinematic. I thought, watching my kids chase each other across the clubhouse lawn, about how differently this could have gone, if Trent hadn't answered that identification post, if Officer Cho hadn't taken the Halted Creek work seriously, if Denise's husband hadn't pushed for those financial records, if Felix hadn't agreed to that modest flat fee all those months ago. None of it had been inevitable. It had been, instead, a long accumulation of small, deliberate choices, mine, and several other people's, refusing to simply accept things as Karen presented them, insisting instead on paperwork, on documentation, on actually reading the bylaws rather than trusting whoever held the gavel to summarize them fairly. That evening, after the picnic wound down, I sat by the pond alone for a while, watching the last of the light catch on the water, Gus and Biscuit and the others settling into their usual evening stillness along the rock. 6 turtles now, soon to be more, in a pond that had somehow survived every attempt to erase it. I thought about Karen occasionally still, Not with anger exactly, more a kind of distant, unresolved curiosity. What exactly had driven someone to build an entire small empire? Out of mailbox flag colors and invented bylaws, to risk criminal charges over $30,000, to stand in my driveway with a hose, determined to finish what she'd started. I never got a real answer to that question, and I'm not sure one exists that would fully satisfy it. Some people, I've come to believe, simply mistake control for competence, authority for identity, and when either starts slipping, panic rather than reflect. Karen panicked. Eventually, spectacularly, in my driveway, in front of a sheriff's deputy. I still received, occasionally, messages from strangers who'd found our story somewhere online or through the local news archive. Homeowners facing their own overreaching HOA boards, wanting advice on how we'd actually won. I never had a tidy formula to offer, just the same rough outline. Document everything. Ask for help. Don't fold just because folding is easier. Trent's turtle population survey, expanded the following year to include several other backyard ponds identified through our story's modest local notoriety, documented a small but genuine wetland corridor forming across 3 neighboring properties, an unplanned, accidental conservation network, born entirely out of one woman's refusal to simply comply with an invented rule. He mentioned, during one visit, that the state was now considering our stretch of properties for a small conservation easement program, offering modest tax incentives to homeowners willing to formally maintain habitat conditions long-term. I signed the preliminary interest form without hesitation, feeling something settle into place that had been unsettled for a very long time. My daughter, now well into her habit of careful, notebook-based turtle documentation, mentioned offhand one evening that she wanted to study wildlife biology when she grew up. Like Trent, I didn't tell her yet how directly her interest traced back to a certified letter and a woman with a spiral notepad. She'll figure that out eventually herself. Rob, ever practical, eventually built a small wooden viewing bench beside the pond, complete with a modest plaque he'd insisted on ordering, Chestnut Hollow wetland habitat. Established accidentally, protected officially, a small, private joke that still makes me laugh every single time I walk past it on my way to feed the fish each morning. The formal state habitat designation letter, framed now and hanging in our hallway beside family photos, occasionally draws questions from visitors who assume it's some kind of official certificate for landscaping excellence. I usually just smile and give the short version. The long version takes considerably longer to tell. Even now, 2 years after Karen's departure, the association's finances, according to the now routine annual audit Arthur's board had voluntarily instituted, showed the healthiest reserve fund in the community's recorded history. No mysterious consulting payments, no unexplained landscaping overruns, just steady, boring, properly documented expenditures matching properly documented budgets. Exactly as it should have always been. I ran into Priscilla once, at the grocery store, nearly a year after she'd resigned from the board. She apologized again, unprompted, for not questioning things sooner. I told her, honestly, that I understood. Trust is easy to extend and hard to reclaim once misplaced. And she'd been far from the only one who'd trusted Karen's word over her own judgment. I read every single page of the bylaws now, she told me, almost proudly, before we parted ways in the parking lot. Every page. I don't care how long it takes. I believed her completely. Karen had taught this entire neighborhood, in the hardest possible way, exactly what happens when nobody bothers to check. Officer Cho, whom I still occasionally exchanged emails with regarding the pond's ongoing protected status, mentioned once that our case had become something of a reference point internally for how quickly documented citizen reporting could support a habitat investigation. "You made our job considerably easier," she said. "Most people don't keep records like you did." I told her, honestly, that keeping those records had felt, at the time, less like strategy and more like simple survival, a way of proving to myself that I wasn't imagining the pattern, that Karen's shifting explanations really were shifting, that the ground really had moved every single time I thought I'd found solid footing. Felix, in one of our last conversations before officially closing the file, told me something that stuck with me longer than almost anything else from the entire ordeal. "Most people who go through something like this," he said, "come out either radicalized against all authority or completely defeated by it. You came out somewhere better than either." I asked him what he meant. "Process," he said. "You just stopped trusting Karen's version of it. There's a difference. Distinction somewhere in the middle of a fight like this." I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. By the third summer after the driveway confrontation, the pond had become something close to a small, unofficial neighborhood landmark, kids from other streets occasionally stopping by, with parental permission, to see the Turtles Trent's published study had made locally, modestly famous. I kept a small guest logbook by the gate, mostly for fun. Gus, now well past 20 years old by Trent's best estimate, remained the pond's steady elder statesman, unbothered as ever by his accidental role in nearly toppling an entire HOA administration. My daughter still greeted him every morning by name, the same small ritual she'd kept since she was 7 years old, uninterrupted by any of it. Karen's name came up less and less over time, mostly surfacing only when a new resident, hearing some abbreviated version of the story, asked in disbelief whether it was actually true. I always confirmed it was, then usually just pointed toward the framed habitat letter in the hallway. Some things are easier shown than explained. I don't know exactly where Karen ended up, beyond Walt's second-hand rumor of a quietly rebuffed committee attempt in her new town. Part of me hopes she found some way to actually reflect on what happened. Another part suspects people who build empires out of invented authority rarely do, and simply move on, looking for the next room. Either way, it stopped mattering to me long before I expected it would. The pond remained, thriving, multiplying, entirely indifferent to the human drama that had briefly threatened to erase them. The neighborhood remained too, steadier now, its governance finally matching the quiet, unremarkable decency most of its residents had always actually had. On a warm evening exactly 2 years after that first certified letter arrived, I sat on Rob's little wooden bench, watching my kids count turtles by flashlight, laughing every time Gus surfaced expecting a late snack. Struck me, quietly, that the very thing Karen had tried hardest to erase was the thing that finally, undeniably, outlasted her. Some fights, I've learned, aren't really about what they first appear to be about. Mine was never really about a goldfish pond, or bylaws, or property lines. It was about whether quiet, patient documentation could stand up against loud, borrowed authority, and eventually, decisively, unmistakably, it did. The pond is still there behind the arborvitae, protected now by paperwork thicker than Karen's old spiral notepad ever was, home to more turtles every season, watched over by a family who once nearly lost it to a woman with a gavel and a grudge. Some victories are quiet. This one, at least, still ripples the water every morning.